Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
Welcome to a sport performance episode of the Experts in Sport podcast with me, Dr. Stuart McErlain-Naylor. Going back a few years, former World's Strongest Man winner and deadlift champion Eddie Hall visited the labs at Loughborough University shortly after winning his world title. The results of that case study have recently been published in the Journal of Applied Physiology. Dr. Tom Balshaw, lecturer in kinesiology, strength and conditioning, and Jonathan Folland, professor of neuromuscular performance, both from the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University, join me today to talk about their experiences of the testing, what they found out, how it compares to other athletes and the general population, and what the novel implications are for our knowledge of the human body. Hi Tom, hi Jonathan, welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast.
Hi Stuart.
Hiya, thanks for joining me. So yeah, we'll jump straight in then. I know you've recently published a case study of a former world's strongest man and deadlift champion. And I think before we get into the really interesting actual results of that kind of lab-based analysis, I'm always really interested in how these things come about. So, for example, one of the previous podcasts we did was with a guy called Neil Smith, who'd tested Cristiano Ronaldo's free kick. And it was kind of fascinating hearing from him, how do you actually end up in a position where one of the greatest ever footballers is in the lab taking his free kick in front of you? And I think on that note, I think I've spoke to Tom about this before, but I remember when I was a PhD student at Loughborough years ago, I remember going to an evening with Eddie Hall or something like that. You know, Eddie Hall was there talking through various aspects of his training, his nutrition, his whatever. It got to a Q&A section at the end, and then a young Tom Balshaw stood up at the back of the room to ask a question. So yeah, Tom, I don't know if you want to take it from there in terms of how did you go from being kind of at an evening with Eddie Hall to then actually having him in the lab for what's turned out to be kind of a really, really interesting case study?
Yeah, sure. Well, Jonathan and I had, prior to that evening happening conveniently in Loughborough, discussed the prospect of, securing a very strong individual to measure for the purposes of a case study. And we'd made some attempts. Jonathan can kind of corroborate, confirm this, that we'd reached out kind of formally via email and hadn't necessarily had kind of any direct reply. And then, this evening with Eddie Hall, shortly after he had won the World's Strongest Man competition in 2017, I think he was on a bit of a tour and Loughborough was one of the stops. And it kind of just seemed like too good of an opportunity to pass up, and went along. And then when they did open it up to the audience Q&A, and I'd had a bottle of beer to kind of get a bit of courage together to ask my question. Yeah, I just kind of, in a roundabout way, asked if Eddie had taken part in any scientific kind of testing or case study activity previously. And he mentioned that he'd done some measurements kind of a number of years ago. I think it was Stretford University. And I think he'd done things to do with Wingate testing and cardiovascular system capacity. But nothing like the kind of thing that we intended to do with him in terms of, comprehensively MRI scanning his lower body. And I basically asked if he'd considered taking part in a study, and that we do a lot of kind of muscle and tendon and strength related testing here at Loughborough University. He basically said, come and speak to me at the end and we'll exchange contact details. And it kind of went from there. Shortly afterwards, Jonathan and I drew together a kind of one-page summary of, what we intended to do with the test day with Eddie coming through to the university. And he responded favourably to what we suggested we would do in terms of the MRI scanning and the whole body strength and power-based tests that we ended up conducting with him. And a few months later, he was rolling up at the university. We spent, a good part of the morning into the early afternoon conducting the various bits of testing. Yeah, the overall day went relatively smoothly, I would say.
Awesome. There's always a positive reward for being the person who's brave enough to stick your hand up and ask the question. So the courage obviously did well.
Yeah, it was. It's obviously been a few years since that all happened, but it's nice to kind of see this type of outcome produced at the end of it.
Brilliant. And I know obviously you kind of alluded to the fact that this is an area that you were both working in anyway. It's not, you're not two random blokes going, oh, wouldn't it be cool to test the world's strongest man? It's something that you've got a lot of experience and expertise in anyway. So I don't know, maybe you can kind of briefly for the listeners just go over like roughly what is it that your work kind of entails? What area is it that you're researching in? Like perhaps Jonathan, if you want to start, just,
Sure.
What is it?
So we obviously have a huge background in measuring and understanding strength and power. So the measurement as a first step, but then understanding the anatomical, physiological and biomechanical factors that influence how strong people are across the whole range of the human spectrum. So from athletes, people who are very well trained and have phenomenal strength and power, like Eddie Hall, or 100-meter track sprinters, or sprint cyclists. We've done studies on these outstanding groups, but all the way through people who are a little bit more mainstream or regular, weekend warriors, and people who train regularly but maybe aren't elite athletes, to recreational exercises and people who maybe don't do that much, down right to, older people who maybe are weaker, not very powerful with their muscles, and that gives them potentially quite a lot of problems in terms of their daily life and their function and what they can do and what they can't do. And also patients suffering from specific illnesses and conditions that are weak and relatively frail and infirm. Sometimes, we do studies on those groups as well, looking at how they can improve their function, how they can rehabilitate to improve their function and their performance in their daily life. So we've had an ongoing interest in strength and power broadly for, in my case, for more than 25 years. And we've done, extensive studies across that range of the human spectrum, including, as I say, the determinants, the underpinning determinants that explain function, and also quite extensively on exercise and training, trying to understand how to improve function through exercise, most obviously resistance, strength training type exercise, but also other types of exercise.
Okay. And Tom, I know you've worked with Jonathan prior to this case study, but how does your work fit into that grand scheme of things?
Yeah, I'm just kind of not entirely on different lines to Jonathan, and function is the kind of primary element that everything boils down to, but we want to understand, what underlying adaptations contribute to people's existing function or changes in function following different types of interventions, with resistance training being a particular focus and emphasis from my perspective. As you mentioned, I've worked as Jonathan's postdoctoral research associate for a number of years, and since kind of taking on the lectureship role, I still have a lot of overlapping interests, and there's certainly a particular interest in me, for me, in terms of understanding how adaptations in the central nervous system, the musculature and tendinous tissue can inform and help us refine interventions that have application or implications for injury prevention and rehabilitation based settings. So that's certainly kind of where my kind of primary line of research is currently focused, and I've got a couple of doctoral researchers kind of doing work in that type of space.
Given our background in strength and power and the existing data and information that we have and the studies we've done, in many ways it's quite a no-brainer to want to test somebody who is right at the top of that long spectrum that I mentioned in terms of strength and power, and understand their characteristics and how do they fit into what we know about those other groups, and the determinants, and how exercise background perhaps has an influence on the characteristics that somebody has. So yeah, for me, it was a completely logical extension of what I've been doing for 25 years to test and understand somebody like Eddie Hall.
And what exactly was it that you really wanted to find out about Eddie Hall? You know, what was it that you really wanted to know to be able to then compare to all of those other athletes and individuals along that spectrum?
Yeah, I guess a starting point, obviously we know he's extraordinarily strong. We know he's got huge muscles. We know those things. But we were interested to see on a descriptive level exactly how big his muscles were. But the main interests were in understanding, firstly, the pattern of his muscularity. So which muscles would be most developed in him, and would we be able to make sense of that? Why would those muscles be the most developed muscles? So that was the first kind of aim, was to understand the pattern of his muscular development in terms of the anatomy and the different muscles. And the second one was to look at his tendons, or particularly the patella tendon, which is attached to the quadriceps muscle, and look at the size of his tendon in relation to the size of that muscle, because that's quite an interesting topic, whether tendons hypertrophy or grow with training, and particularly strength training, is a little bit of a controversial topic. And we were interested to see if we could get any insight into that by looking at somebody who's done an extreme amount of strength training.
How do you go about preparing for that day then? You know, does Eddie Hall simply slot into the protocols and everything you've done for 25 years? Or did you have to kind of make any adaptations? Was there any kind of preliminary work that went into it before he arrived?
There was quite a lot of preliminary work, to be honest with you. It was maybe slightly over engineered, if anything, in terms of the amount of kind of time and effort, but we felt that was necessary because it was very much a kind of one shot opportunity. It wasn't like we could phone him back up and get him back in the following week if things went wrong. We needed to, make sure everything was going to run smoothly. And that went from everything to everything from the MRI scanner, and first of all determining, could we, actually fit somebody who weighs 170 plus kilograms into the MRI scanner that we have. It's a very modern and, high quality MRI scanner, but there's only a certain amount of space within the scanner. The area that the person fits into is called the bore of the MRI scanner. We're fortunate that the scanner that we have is actually a wide bore scanner, which affords a little bit more space than a lot of other MRI scanners. But we still did want to, test, could we fit somebody that big into the scanner? So we did actually have a kind of like a body double, who was a master's level power lifter who weighed somewhere in the region of kind of 190 to 200 kilos. And we basically, asked him to come along, and we scanned him and wanted to ensure that we could actually fit somebody with, a much more mass than anybody else that we've measured previously into that space. And also, what would the quality of the images look like when you put somebody in who's, got that additional mass compared to the kind of, average individual that we measure. And even when it comes to athletes, most of the athletes we measure, from the resistance trained individuals to the power-based athletes that were included within the case study, very few of them weigh over 100 kilos. And the heaviest are probably kind of in the 90 kilo bracket. So when you get somebody in who's almost double that, can they fit, and what does it do to the quality of the images that you're acquiring during scanning? So we did have a body double in probably about a month or two before, just to kind of see, is this going to work in the first place as expected, or are we going to come up against some unforeseen problems? So that was kind of the main thing we did to prepare from the MRI scan side of things. And then in terms of the functional testing, we had a range of different individuals, pretty strong resistance trained guys into our testing laboratory. And we did kind of play around quite a lot with the testing setup for both the isometric mid-thigh pull test. There's kind of like a static bar that you pull against. And we played around with different setups using individual force platforms under both feet, or having an individual force platform which both feet were placed on, or having separate force platforms, one with one foot on each. And we just kind of had to play around with the setup and the way that the feedback was displayed. And we just tried to get a feel for what was going to be practical for those kind of assessments, and to basically make sure that, you know, when we get some really strong people in the lab to perform these tests, what kind of numbers are being produced. And if we project that kind of, you know, even twofold up or more, are we going to be able to measure what we're expecting Eddie might be able to possibly produce? So there was quite a lot of groundwork that went in to get everything set up.
To pick up on the MRI kind of preparations, one of the things we realised is that whilst we would have liked to have scanned Eddie Hall's upper body, actually that's incredibly awkward in the scanner, because it's got a fixed bore. And to scan an arm, you'd need to get an arm into the centre of the scanner bore to get a good image. And he's so wide at the shoulders and in the upper body that it was practically impossible to do that. And we kind of realised that in scanning the person we had in advance who was of similar dimensions. So so it was really useful, because it kind of highlighted we weren't going to be able to do that. And then we focused our efforts on the lower body.
What did the day entail then? So when Eddie Hall actually arrived on campus at Loughborough University, you've mentioned MRI scans, you've mentioned some kind of isometric mid-thigh pull, strength-based testing. And what else was involved in that day? What did it look like?
Well, we started the day with the MRI scans because, and there's a good scientific reason for that, in that exercise produces changes in fluid shifts around the body and blood flow to the muscles. So to do an accurate MRI scan, it's generally recommended to do that before exercise. So we started with the MRI scan. He did that first, and we concentrated on the muscles, and then moved on to the tendons. And after that, after he had a bit of food at lunchtime, we moved into the neuromuscular lab and did some functional performance tests, the isometric mid-thigh pull, vertical jumping.
How did those performances compare to what you expected on the day when you've had your kind of master's level athlete in, trying to expect what kind of numbers might we get? Can we cope with those numbers? Was it about what you expected, or was there anything that took you by surprise?
Yeah, roughly around where I expected. I mean, it's all a bit of an unknown, obviously. But the jumping was really interesting. Obviously, a standard vertical counter movement jump is a very standard test in sports science. But watching somebody of that size jump as high as he did, he's jumped 53 centimeters. Tom, was that right? I think. Yeah. So, which is a good jump, but you've got to remember he was 172 kilos. So, there's a huge amount of power involved in projecting that mass upwards that far. So he could jump pretty well, despite the fact that he's this huge mass. And that was pretty interesting to watch, to be honest. I was slightly worried about the portable force plate we had and whether it would be able to deal with the loads, but it managed it. So
is that 53 centimeters relative to standing, or is that 53 centimeters post takeoff?
No, relative to standing.
Yeah.
Relative to stationary standing.
Yeah. And then what about the more strength-based side of things? Kind of, if you can remember, what kind of numbers were you seeing? I guess he can do a 500 kilogram deadlift, so you've kind of got an idea of what you might expect from a similar kind of movement. But was it in that kind of ballpark, or I imagine probably numbers a bit less, given that you're not in optimum condition on the day of testing?
The static or isometric mid-thigh pull, the amount of newtons of force that was produced was 7,480 newtons, which corresponds to around about 762 kilograms. So in terms of, kilograms, it was actually, what he pulled was more than his deadlift, but there's a very big difference in the position that he was pulling in, with the bar kind of situated in a fixed position around about mid-thigh level. So kind of like a pretty kind of flexed kind of knee joint angle. He wasn't standing bolt upright. He had a good kind of nice comfortable flex in his knee, and he was pulling from what is considered a pretty strong position relative to the starting position of a deadlift, where the bar is whatever it is, 9 inches off the ground if you've got Olympic plates on either side of the barbell. So yeah, that's what he pulled in terms of kilograms during that particular test, but it's a very mechanically very different situation than a maximum deadlift, the kind of thing that he's held world records in previously and regularly conducted in competitive events.
It's probably relevant to say we tested him, I think it was 13 or 14 months after his World's Strongest Man victory, and a couple of years after he did the 500 kilo deadlift. And he said he wasn't in that kind of form when we tested him. But he was still competing and still training regularly. So he was still in pretty good form, but he was very clear he wasn't in the kind of shape he had been, when he, kind of recorded those victories and lifts.
I imagine then the majority of the findings obviously takes a long time post-testing to process all the data and kind of run the statistical analyses, etc. But then beyond just what was peak force on the day, moving on to the actual study now, so the case study that you've published recently, what were the main findings within that? I don't know if you want to kind of take it in any particular order or start in a particular area of the study, but I'm just interested to know, what did you actually find at the end of all of this?
Well, maybe if I talk about the muscle side first of all, and of course, he's got a huge muscle mass. In the lower body muscles, way bigger than anybody we've measured before. Overall muscle mass in the order of 30% bigger than anyone we've measured. And double that of a regular untrained individual. So twice as much overall muscle mass or muscle volume compared to an untrained but healthy young man. And that wasn't surprising at all, of course. It's very obvious he's got very big muscles. He's extremely muscular. But we were interested in the pattern of that muscularity and which muscles showed the most development. And there were some really interesting things there. In terms of kind of major muscle groups, the one that showed the greatest development were actually his calf muscles, so his plantar flexors, to use the technical term. And that kind of makes sense because, however much he's lifting or carrying in strongman exercises, all of that weight and load and force has to go through the ankle in some way. Extreme development of that muscle would seem to be highly useful. So that was the first thing. And the next thing is when we went down to the level of the individual muscles, then there were some even more interesting patterns. The muscles that showed the most development weren't the kind of the big kind of gross mover type muscles that you might expect, like the hip extensors or the knee extensors. They were certainly big, no question, but they weren't the biggest. They didn't show the greatest development. The greatest development was actually in 3 long, thin muscles, which are not well known. And the the function of these muscles actually not that well understood, to be honest. And they're three muscles called the guy ropes muscles, which are, as I say, three long, thin muscles. They all have an attachment down below the knee on the inside of the leg. And then they all come up and attach onto different locations on the pelvis. And they act as guy ropes for the pelvis. That are probably very important in stabilizing the pelvis and the thigh. That's what their recognized kind of role is. And they were enormous. They were between 2 and 3 times the size of those in an untrained, healthy young man. And biomechanically, that does make sense. We think it's logical because if you're lifting and carrying heavy loads, you have to be able to hold the pelvis and the thigh stable and in a coordinated position. So these muscles need to be strong in order to do that. Therefore, they need to be really big. And that's really interesting because the importance of those muscles, whilst it's known they have that role, but they would be so important, so apparently important, is really interesting and novel.
So how much of that then, if this is a comparison between world's strongest man and average population or untrained people, and you have a bigger difference in those muscles than any of the other more stereotypically kind of big muscles that you would potentially associate with the world's strongest man, how much of that is kind of, don't say overdeveloped, but kind of well-developed musculature within him, and how much of that is kind of maybe underdeveloped in the general population? You know, I'm thinking if the modern untrained population, for whatever reason, results in underdeveloped musculature, that's kind of giving you a lower threshold that everything else is relative to. Do you think there is a bit of that, or do you think it's just actually for the movements that he's doing, those muscles are so important for stability that they are just so much bigger than what we've ever seen before in other populations?
Yeah, it's a great question. Is it that he's extremely developed or that untrained people are kind of undeveloped? I think that's kind of the thrust. That's a really interesting point. And it's certainly possible that modern untrained humans don't do a lot of lifting and carrying in everyday life. And therefore, these muscles may be relatively underdeveloped, whereas modern humans probably still do a reasonable amount of walking and running and general locomotion and mobility, which involves those kind of larger, big muscles, the hip extensors, the knee extensors. So it's certainly possible that is part of what's producing this very extreme difference for the guy ropes muscles.
Yeah, but either way, it's, like you say, interesting that it's not what you necessarily would expect, but it does have a kind of biomechanical explanation where you go, oh, that does actually make sense now we think about it, that
yes,
carrying such massive loads would require that adaptation.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's really interesting to find something like that in a case study.
So if that's the kind of some of the muscle-based results then, what about tendons? Because you mentioned earlier that you moved on from muscle to tendon, and you were kind of quite interested in comparing how the tendons have adapted in relation to how the muscle has adapted. What did you find there?
So, yeah, the muscle and the tendon form an overall unit that is responsible for generating and transmitting force to the skeleton and ultimately producing movement. And we were really interested in assessing in this very extreme individual who's, incredibly strong, whether the size of the muscle and tendon scale together or whether there's a disproportionate difference in the size of the muscle relative to the tendon. So we basically compared Eddie's muscle size to that of our untrained population to examine what the proportional difference was relative to the untrained people, and did the same with the tendon. And if the two tissues had scaled up in size in an equivalent manner, then you would see similar proportional differences. But in fact, what we saw was that the size of the quadricep muscles was equal to or greater than twice that of the untrained individuals for Eddie, whereas his tendon cross-sectional area, a measurement of the size of his tendon, was only 30% larger. So in comparison to his muscle size being so much larger than an untrained population, his tendon size, while still a good amount larger, was a more moderate kind of proportion greater than our untrained population, which suggests that there's some uncoupling of muscle and tendon size when you have an individual who has, reached this level of performance within the sport of strongman and is capable of producing the kind of muscular forces that Eddie Hall is capable of producing. So that kind of covers what we saw in terms of the tendinous tissue results. The other thing to mention is that we did also measure the amount of leverage that Eddie has at his knee joint, and the amount of leverage that you have at the knee joint, which is measured as a kind of distance between the tendon and the kind of center of the joint, or the point where the kind of joint rotates, was larger than untrained individuals by 18%. But again, relative to how much larger his quadricep muscle size was, this was, a rather modest difference, which kind of does indicate that the size of his quadriceps are, playing a large role in his lower body strength capability, probably over and above over and above joint leverage, which we measured as a variable called moment arm.
Is there any way of assessing what has adapted within that space? So say, you're talking about the cross-sectional area of the muscle or the tendon. If the muscle, as I've kind of understood it, gets bigger more than the tendon does, is it that the tendon is adapting and making changes to its structure within that space that it already has? Or is it just that there's relatively little adaptation at all compared to the muscle?
Yeah, I think there's two slightly different aspects to the tendon. There's one, its quantity or its size, which we've seen in Eddie was somewhat larger than certainly an average untrained person, but not that much larger. And then there's the quality of the tissue and whether the tissue's intrinsic properties have adapted. We didn't look at that in the case study. That would be an interesting thing to consider. But the scientific literature is pretty clear that the quality or the properties of the tissue do change with exercise and training, particularly high load type exercise. Whereas the quantity of the tendon, its size, whether that changes, is a bit more of a controversial point. It may change in certain conditions and it may not in others, but it isn't nearly as clear as the tissue quality changing, which is very clear.
Okay. So just to check I've understood correctly then, despite the fact that relatively the tendon cross-sectional area had increased less than that of the muscle, it was still in itself greater than kind of the other populations that you looked at. So you did still kind of see a larger tendon than what you're used to seeing, even if it wasn't as extreme as the muscle result.
Yeah, that's right. Compared to average group values, that's correct. However, if we look at the full range of individuals we've measured before, untrained groups and trained groups, his tendon wasn't out with that range. It was within that range. We have measured other individuals with similar sized tendons. Whereas when we look at the muscle, his quadriceps muscle was at least, I think, a third bigger than anybody we've measured, or clearly larger. So his muscle is kind of unique in its size properties. His tendon was much more normal, a little bit bigger than the average, but within the range.
Okay. And I fully appreciate I'm getting into the realms now of asking you to speculate about things you haven't actually measured, but I'm interested in what this may mean for injury risk for various populations. So in my mind, if the muscle is adapting at a greater rate than the tendon, is that a problem for risk of tendinous injury? Or is it a case of, the tendon is already strong enough, so it doesn't necessarily have to adapt as much?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and there's kind of competing thoughts on that. Yeah, from a logical point of view, if the muscle gets a lot bigger, it can produce a lot more force, and if the tendon doesn't adapt to the same extent, then there might be increased vulnerability. However, the counter to that is that tendons typically have what's known as a large safety margin. They are much stronger than they kind of need to be in their normal circumstance. Now, clearly, if you go to an extreme situation like Eddie Hall, where the muscle is potentially twice as big as it was at one stage, we don't really know how much of what he's done is due to training and how much is due to inherited characteristics, but maybe the muscle certainly is bigger than it would have been if he'd never done any strength training. The tendon probably hasn't changed as much. Maybe that does put the tendon a little bit closer to the point where it could fail, possibly. And clearly in athletes, tendons do fail occasionally. And in the general population as well. People do rupture their Achilles tendon, is perhaps the most common one, but other tendons as well. But we don't know if that's got anything to do with strength training, really, or whether that is actually some kind of maladaptation in the tendon that means that there's a specific individual issue with that tendon that means it fails far more easily and earlier in terms of the force level than you might expect.
Okay, and you mentioned inherited characteristics there. That reminded me of something I was going to ask when Tom was talking about leverage or moment arms earlier on. So with that leverage, is that something you're born with in terms of where the tendon inserts, or is that something that can adapt due to training? And I guess to kind of extend that a bit, with the other results you've mentioned, and whether it's muscle or tendon, just any indication or kind of speculation around how nature and nurture interact in all of this in order to create what is the strongest person that you've ever had in the lab?
Yeah. So in terms of which of the characteristics perhaps have adapted, I think the moment arm would be the one where you'd say that probably isn't an adaptation. That's probably inherent because it's to do with the skeletal structure of his knee joint and where the tendon inserts, which probably doesn't change.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, do you remember whether that was within the range of values you've seen before, or was it, his moment arm was outside the range of anything you've ever seen before?
It was a little bit out with the largest value that we've measured, I believe, but not by that much. It was definitely the largest moment arm that we've measured. But I think it was relatively subtle. Just looking at the value now, 3% greater than the highest individual moment arm we've previously assessed is the actual statistic.
Okay.
Or value.
That in itself is really interesting to me when Jonathan alludes to the fact that that's maybe a lot more nature than nurture, but then that is in itself outside the range of what you've seen before. But yeah, sorry, Jonathan, I cut you off in the middle of your nature versus nurture.
That's right about the leverage and the moment arm. That's almost certainly an inherited characteristic, and he's had that advantage his whole life, and that might have been one of the things which pulled him into strength type sports, because he will have been strong anyway, irrespective of anything else, because of that fact. But in terms of muscle, well, certainly muscle is very adaptable. We know that. And with strength training, muscle will progressively get larger and grow. And that's very well documented. With tendon, it's less clear, as I described earlier on. So I would say there's a bit of a hierarchy in adaptability, where muscle is the most adaptable. Tendon, we're a bit uncertain, possibly a little bit. And then the kind of joint mechanics, leverage, probably not at all. But coming back to the more general question about nature or nurture, and particularly say in terms of his muscles, which is perhaps more important? Well, that's very difficult to say. Without having measurements over a period of time, we simply don't really know. But as I mentioned, muscle is very adaptable. So the fact that he has this quite interesting pattern to his muscularity, with some muscles very well developed and others not nearly as much. So there were other muscles which were down perhaps in the region of just 30% bigger than an untrained person. An average untrained person who would probably be about 1.77 meters. And Eddie Hall is 1.90 meters or so. So there's immediately a height difference, and we would expect bigger people to have bigger muscles anyway. So, yeah, the fact that some muscles were only a little bit bigger than untrained suggests they haven't probably undergone a huge amount of adaptation. And then you've got these other muscles which are 3 times bigger, that kind of suggests to me that nurture, the environment, and training do play a really big role in muscularity. But it is very difficult to quantify their relative importance.
Yeah, especially when they interact with each other, and the nature affects how the nurture actually then has its own effect.
That's right. So the kind of inherited characteristics influence the response to exercise and training. So it's quite a tricky thing to untangle.
Okay. So how does all of this then kind of, or does this tell us anything about the limiting factors in human performance as a whole? So if you're measuring someone who we kind of have to believe is towards the very limits of what is humanly possible, does that teach us anything about, the limits of human physical performance and adaptation?
Well, I guess I come at it as somebody with a lifelong interest pretty much in muscle physiology, and the muscle physiology seems hugely important in somebody's performance and function, including the size of their muscles and the pattern of their muscularity is almost certainly extremely important in somebody's capability for strength and power, including Eddie Hall, but other strength and power athletes. So when we've taken these kind of muscle size measurements with magnetic resonance imaging of 100-meter track sprinters, the elite sprinters also have a very specific pattern to their muscularity and are very developed in certain muscles, which allows them to run really fast. So it's just reinforcing the point that the muscle anatomy and physiology are crucial for strength and power performance. Okay,
so is there, given that you've gone through this whole process, and I could talk about for ages, fascinating results, and I think truly one of a kind, really case study. But what still remains unknown, or if you could go through the whole thing again, is there anything that you wish you'd tested on the day but didn't, or anything that you wish you could get 2017, 2018 Eddie back in and test again as a follow-up now that you've actually got the results of the first time?
Well, the one that we would like to have done, we had a little bit of a go at it, but didn't do it as carefully as we perhaps should have done, and that was to look at his muscle architecture. That is the kind of internal structure of his muscles, which is usually described by 2 measurements: the angle of fiber pennation, which is the angle at which the fibers run through the muscle, and the length of the fibers or fascicles, which are the bundles of fibers it would have been really interesting to have really good measures on that from Eddie Hall as well, to understand the internal structure of his muscles better. So that would be one thing, and the other one would be to take a muscle biopsy sample and understand the composition and the makeup of his fibers. I would assume he's got a pretty fast twitch composition, because that is undoubtedly useful for strength and power. But beyond that, it would have been interesting to look at the internal ultrastructure of his fibers, and particularly the myofibrils, which are the small units that contain actin and myosin contractile filaments, and also look at the spacing of those filaments. So some of those structural parameters in somebody exposed to his history of high load resistance training, and also his inherited characteristics, would have been fascinating to see how much of an outlier he was for some of those things as well.
Definitely. And I guess moving on from this World's Strongest Man case study and back into the whole spectrum of human performance that you alluded to at the start, from completely untrained sedentary individuals, older populations, people going through rehabilitation, etc. What are you working on at the moment in this kind of space? And is there anything you're really excited about over the next few years, and where I guess our knowledge of neuromuscular physiology is going?
Yeah, well, from my perspective, I guess I'm at the moment probably doing a bit more work at the lower end of that spectrum. So we're going to be doing some work with chronic kidney disease patients who suffer from a lot of muscle wasting and atrophy, and therefore they're weak and they're fairly frail. So we're going to be hoping to try and understand their function better, and look at some interventions to try and improve their function. Similarly, we've been doing a block of work on osteoarthritis patients, also understanding their function and the morphological, structural, anatomical factors to do with their muscles, and the neural factors to do with the nervous system and the control of their muscles, and what explains their weakness and their frailty. So there's some of the things that I'm working on at the moment.
Okay. And what about you, Tom? What's going on in your research world at the moment?
Yeah, I have two doctoral researchers who are doing different things in the neuromuscular physiology kind of overall space. One of them is kind of looking at optimization of exercise prescription, that within a setting that has implications for rehabilitation for conditions or injuries where one side of the body is injured, and this essentially involves training one side of the body and measuring changes or adaptations in the other or opposite limb. So we can basically train one arm, and the other arm that remains untrained can get stronger. This increase in the untrained arm is influenced by central nervous system mechanisms within the brain and the spinal cord. And at the moment, one of my students is looking at what effect manipulating different training variables has on the extent of strength increase in the untrained limb, and trying to understand some of the lesser investigated central nervous system pathways that might be involved in this established phenomenon, which is often referred to as interlimb strength transfer or cross-education of strength. My other student is looking at some similar central nervous system pathway characteristics, and trying to investigate whether these central nervous system properties are predictive of postural control ability or balance capability, and also whether some of these central nervous system characteristics change as we age, which isn't something that's had a lot of focus placed on it.
Great. And then for both of you, like if people are interested in this area of strength and conditioning or neuromuscular physiology, and they want to find out more about your previous work, or they're excited about what you just said and want to get the results to those studies as they happen and as they get published. Is there any kind of way of people keeping up to date with this area, or anything that you'd recommend they check out?
I guess keep an eye on our publications would be the one of the main things.
Yeah, PubMed is good. You can set up alerts for authors whose work that you're interested in. It's kind of a fairly intuitive system. It's free to sign up for, and will give you alerts when, you know, authors that you've set up alerts for produce new work. Social media can be a good place to follow certain scientific authors as well. I have a social media page that I post kind of our latest research work on. And yeah, there are other kind of resources out there that can be utilized to keep up with the scientific literature. It's kind of a case of just being a bit critical of, you know, where you're getting your information from, and the best place to get it from is the source, which is the peer-reviewed scientific journals.
Thanks both. And yeah, I guess to finish with, congratulations on the publication and all the hard work that went into it, and I guess the well-deserved interest that it's had over the last couple of weeks, which has been good to see. And yeah, just thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Stu.
You're welcome. Thank you.
To read the full case study, check out the link to the publication in Journal of Applied Physiology within the show notes of this episode.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.